In about 20 minutes or so from now, we expect the outgoing head of the NPA, Shamila Batohi, to give her final address in the position. She'll be delivering the annual NPA report. Batohi's been under fire for unilaterally leaving the Nkabinde inquiry investigating the fitness for office of the Joburg prosecutions boss, Andrew Chauke. She refused to answer certain questions and left the inquiry without permission. But before that, she was, of course, in charge of the NPA for nearly 7 years. Michael Marchant is at Open Secrets. They are a body that's been campaigning for the prosecution of state capture suspects. Michael, good afternoon to you. I suppose we need to go back a little bit. If you go back to when Shamila Batohi took over the NPA, the institution had been hollowed out. It had factions within it. The argument was it had protected then-President Jacob Zuma. How would you compare the NPA she took over, February 2019, with what it's like now?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I think that what most people will agree is that the legacy of Shamila Batohi as NDPP will inherently be mixed. And the main reason for exactly as you've was hollowed out. In many ways, it appeared to be a deeply toxic working environment where there was very little trust and very low capacity to take on the type of cases that South Africans were so eager to see carried forward in terms of accountability. You fast forward 7 years, and I think the number one thing that people will probably be upset about is that have we seen as much progress with regards to accountability? And the answer to that is inescapably no, we haven't. We've seen very little progress on high-profile cases. What I will say is that I think it is safe to say that the NPA is in a better place now than it was in 2019, that there have been efforts, certainly by the leadership under Batohi, to bring a degree of stability, to empower new institutions like the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption. And so it's in a better place, but of course the bar, as you've described, given the status of 2019, was incredibly low. And I think that quite rightly the public and many people in civil society had greater expectations for the amount of progress that we would have seen.
As always, when you have an institution, particularly a hierarchical institution like the NPA, where you have someone at the top who literally does make decisions that matter, you want to blame, and I think we're allowed to hold the person at the top accountable for what's happened. Should we be blaming her? I mean, there's certain factors that make me think in some ways it was very difficult to do the job and maybe made more difficult than it should have been by some people who still hold significant power in our society.
I think, again, and not to sit on the fence, but I think that both of those things are true. I think that it was an incredibly difficult job. It was always going to be that. And I think it will continue. You know, the head of the NPA in South Africa will continue to be an incredibly difficult job to do successfully. And I think maybe, Stephen, you're pointing to a couple of things that are important to note in terms of kind of systemic problems that Batohi and the NPA leadership would have faced. One of those very clearly is probably insufficient funding linked to insufficient independence from government. And I think that the NPA has consistently said this, and they're absolutely correct, is that they are probably not being given the extent of the resources they need in order to take on high-profile and very complex cases. And yet, given all of that, I think what we have to keep returning to is that even if we understood and appreciated that the NPA was not going to be able to do everything, we can, I think, have expected it to have identified a few key priorities and to have done those things well. And I think that is where Batohi has to take a lot of responsibility where things have not gone well. And I'm speaking specifically here about certain high-profile state capture cases that the NPA itself and Batohi herself identified as seminal or priority cases that have subsequently fallen apart in court or been struck off the roll due to the NPA's delays and in various other ways have failed. Now, in some instances, that is partly the direct fault of other institutions, such as the Hawks, but also more junior prosecutors. But ultimately, in a situation like this, I think in any institution, we can expect and we should demand some accountability to be taken by the head and the leader of the organization.
The last few months of her Tenny, I'm sure going to be remembered for what happened at the inquiry into the fitness for office of the head of prosecutions in South Gauteng, Andrew Chauke, an inquiry she wanted. Certainly there seems to be evidence to merit such an inquiry. But it was quite a strange moment. She then suddenly, while giving testimony, while under oath, refused to answer questions. She left the inquiry without permission, which, as I understand it, is actually breaking the law. Now, I must just say this is quite a complicated situation. There are many different factors yet, and we don't yet know how that entire process will end or what findings will be made. Should she have handled that entire situation differently?
Stephen, I think that she should have. I think that you're right to give the disclaimer that that process is not fully played out. And so I'll also exercise some caution in not assuming the kind of final outcome. But I do think that there's really two very important things to understand about that entire situation. The first is, as you've said at the start, one of the primary things that I think Batoh needed to do at the NPA, and she's herself said this in various ways over the years, was to try and remove what she as the leadership saw as obstacles within the NPA to progress. And certainly she has made very clear, and of course by instigating this inquiry into Andrew Chauke's fitness to hold office, she clearly saw that as an important part of trying to address internal accountability within the NPA. And as you've said, the inquiry is not yet complete, but of course we as the public are aware of the extent and the seriousness of the allegations against Andrew Chauke, because so many of them went before the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture and have been made public in various ways. And so it was an important test. And I think the second thing which you're speaking to here is that in many ways, Batoh's performance at the inquiry and the kind of dramatic and very strange way in which she left, in many ways, I think for me, exemplifies some of the strange things that have happened at the NPA over the years, in that she had clearly identified this as so fundamentally important, and yet quite bizarrely seemed to be caught by surprise by an interrogation of the facts that were the basis for the inquiry. And for someone in her position to appear at the commission and certainly, on the face of it, from what we've all seen so far, almost seem underprepared on some of the basic facts that form the very kind of fundamental basis of the inquiry. It speaks to, I think, some of the disturbing scenes we've seen in some other state capture cases and other high-profile NPA failures over the years, where there is almost an identification of something that's important and then perhaps an inexplicable appearance of a lack of proper preparation to see that through. I certainly hope that there's a space for this inquiry to get back, on track, and for there to be a full and fair exploration of the facts. But certainly, I think Batoh's behavior has not at this point helped that commission in its mission at all.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael.